Since 2008, we've witnessed a spectacle in Europe where the southern Mediterranean nations of Spain, Portugal, but especially Italy and Greece, are essentially begging from Northern Europe for cash. We have about 120 million in those latter countries, and yet they produce not much more goods and services than is created in Germany alone. And if you look at Northern European culture, economy, politics, it seems more stable, more prosperous, more secure, I think everybody would agree, than Southern Mediterranean. There's no law that says Northern European shall be more prosperous and successful than Southern European. And remember the key point in this comparison. It wasn't always so. Classical civilization began in Greece and later in Rome. And Near Eastern civilization itself started in places like Anatolia, the Holy Land, Egypt. There were advantages, in other words, of the Mediterranean that connected three continents, of a warm climate that allowed people to engage in outdoor activities, and in a climate far more suitable to agriculture. That's why we had the Parthenon or the Pantheon at the same period, a Germanic tribe like the Cimbri or the Helvetii in Switzerland or the Germani, all of the tribes in Germany together. Whichever particular Northern European tribe we focus upon, they were backward. They had no sophisticated writing, they had no literature, they had no monumental building, they had no advanced idea of politics. They were, to use a better word of my own ancestors, savages. So something must have happened to flip what otherwise had been European history for quite some time. Today, as we look at the crisis facing Italy or Spain or Portugal, you ask yourself, isn't there a Magellan in Portugal anymore? Aren't there two Roman emperors of the caliber of Trajan or Hadrian to come out of Spain to rule Europe? There's no Cicero, and for all the writing in Greece, we can't find one Pericles, we can't find a Socrates in the Agora. Where are all of these classical giants from these once prosperous, successful, and cohesive, stable societies? What happened? Because if we were to look at society in 431 BC, in 30 AD, any time up to essentially the 5th century AD, the focus point of Western civilization was in the south, and the north was wild and uninhabited and only slowly becoming Christianized and Romanized. The same was true basically through much of the Middle Ages and also all the way up until, say, 1400, 1450 perhaps. After all, the standard for much of Europe was the gold florin from Florence. That's the seat of the great Italian Renaissance. It was a mercantile center. At one point, perhaps by 1450, Venice was one of the most populated, prosperous cities in the world. We could easily say earlier that at 1200, Constantinople was the largest and most successful municipality in Europe. And yet that was simply not true by 1600 or 1700, and especially not true today. If any of you listeners would like to get your appendix out, or would you like to have a gallbladder operation, I suggest you do it in London or Berlin or Paris, and you do not do it in Palermo or Athens. Something has changed. Now, what was that, and when did it change, and what can it tell us? It's been a theme throughout these lectures that the rise of Islam altered European history as much as it did the history of the Middle East itself. And from the 7th century AD on, Islam encroached into formerly Roman-held North Africa. It made inroads into Iberia all the way up into southern France. On two occasions, remember, in the 16th and 17th century, it was at the gates of Vienna itself. And what seemed to repress that was the Byzantine Empire. In other words, what is now Greece was a part of a garrison state, always at war with Islam. Venice was always at war with Islam. 1571 Battle of Lepanto, it's fighting for its life against Islam as manifested by the Ottoman Empire. It gave a breathing corridor, so to speak, a breathing spell, a sanitary corridor around most of Northern Europe due to the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, so that they could develop in their own fashion without worry that they were going to be absorbed by a much more unified caliphate, or later the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, which became Istanbul. There's another reason as well. Greece never created the idea of a nation. City-states, polis, 1,500 of them, but there was not a cohesive government entity in Greece. Rome did, and it became imperial, but with the dissolution of the empire in the 5th century AD, it reverted back to its earlier history of city-states, a Pisa, a Genoa, a Venice, a Rome, a Florence, the Papal States, Syracuse, whatever. But there's not going to be in Southern Europe to the same degree a notion of statehood as there is in Northern Europe. Greece, after the destruction of the city-state system in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, it's absorbed by Hellenistic monarchies, and then it's absorbed by Rome, and then it's absorbed by the Byzantine Empire, and then it's absorbed as a province of the Ottomans. But there is not going to be a notion of a cohesive, unified state in Greece where all people speak the same language, they have the same aspirations, the same values, and operate under similar protocols until about 1821. And even parts of Greece as we know it today were not absorbed until the late 19th and early 20th century. When was the unification of Italy? Not until the late 19th century under Garibaldi. In contrast, we could make the argument that England, or Great Britain as we know it today, was pretty much finalized in the 13th century. I know they had problems with Wales and Scotland and Ireland, but the idea of a British kingdom, a nation sovereign state, is not that different today than it was in the 14th century. And the same is true of France. There's another thing to keep your eye on, and that's German-speaking tribal groups that had given Rome so much difficulty. They developed into nation states and small nation states. Remember, there were far more Germanic speakers in Northern Europe than there were French speakers or English speakers. But they had always been separate. There had been a Bavaria, there had been a Prussia, there had been an East Prussia, there had been a Saxony, and they were never combined. But they were nation states. They were not going to be combined until 1866, 67, and then immediately we had a war in 1870, a war in 1914, a war in 1939. But until that period, Northern Europe was not pressured by a hostile entity that had greater resources that was comparable to Islam. What am I getting at? Northern Europe developed the idea of a nation state much more effectively than did Southern Europe, partly because of the pressure of Islam and partly because the classical legacy of autonomy of a municipality, of a Venice or a Florence, that gave it enormous advantages as far as collective wealth, the ability to marshal a great fleet in the manner of Britain, the idea of uniting people under a similar and like government. There was a couple of other reasons why power shifted to Northern Europe in a way that just didn't seem comprehensible given our knowledge of classical history. Of course, we've talked about it before, is the Reformation. Greece was the nominal head, the Greek speakers of Orthodoxy, the Patriarch in Constantinople and in Mistra in the Morea. And of course, Catholicism was centered with the Pope for most of the time in Rome. It was much, much more difficult for Southern Europeans, given their proximity and their legacy and heritage as the original provinces of the Roman Empire, to break away from Catholicism. That was not true among the recently converted Christians. I say recently, they had at least 500 to 600 years after the original Roman conversion. But it was much easier for them, Northern Europeans, to experiment, to question, to break away from Orthodox Catholicism. So we had a Protestant Reformation mostly in Northern Europe. And for all practical purposes, if you look at the religious affiliation of countries like Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy, it's about 90 to 98% in the West Catholic and in the East Orthodox. In contrast, if today you look at Germany, it's about 35% Protestant, maybe 40. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, they can range from 85 to 90% Protestant, and it's not necessarily clear that the other percentages are all Catholic. They could be Muslim, or they can be agnostics or atheists, or in some small cases Jewish. But the point that I'm making is that even today, Northern Europe is far more Protestant than is Southern Europe. Did that have economic consequences? Yes, I think it did. Calvinism, one of the great tenets of Protestantism, said that people were blessed when they made money, and that God's grace and God's selection of the truly devout and the truly blessed for eternity, that could be manifest on earth by material wealth. So we inverted the old classical religious paradigm that wealthy people were suspect and we said wealthy people were evidence of God's will on earth. And that tended to be, in strictly economic terms, forget religion, it tended to be an incentive for people to create businesses, create wealth, without the suspicion of a hierarchical church. And remember that within about 150 years, there were not just Lutheranism or baptism or Methodism. There were literally hundreds of Protestant sects. So religion became decentralized and adapted to local economic, social, and political conditions. And it was much more conducive to business. And so by the 16th and 17th century, those effects were being felt in a way that Southern Europe was starting to stagnate, partly because of the pressure of Islam, partly because of the notion of the city-state or provincialism, but also because of this religious factor. There was another couple of reasons that we should also look for. The Mediterranean had been a great advantage in the classical world all the way up until about 1500. After all, there's very few currents on the Mediterranean. You can go from anywhere in the Mediterranean in one day and find land. There's the great islands of Malta or Crete or Sicily as way stations. It opens up into the Black Sea. You can go from Eastern Mediterranean to Western Mediterranean, north and south, and you're at the nexus of three continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And all that was an enormous advantage to people who were pre-industrial. By that I mean they didn't have to build sophisticated ships, single or double sail, galleys, rowing, triremes, whatever the particular ship or vessel. They were all effective on the Mediterranean. It was a lake. That's what the Romans called it, RC. Plato said frogs around a pond. However, there were other oceans in the world. And with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, then suddenly the West, Northern Europe, was cut off from trade from China and India overland through the Silk routes that dumped into the Black Sea and were protected by the Byzantine Navy. Suddenly it became an Ottoman monopoly, and that forced a lot of radical rethinking in places like Western France, Western Spain, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, even a little bit in Germany, but especially in Britain. And that thinking said, is there a way to have access to China and India and the wealth of the East, whether it be silk or spice or whatever the particular need or necessity or commodity, without having to deal with the Ottomans and without the dangers of an overland route and without the wait for these goods to arrive, and especially since now there is no such thing as an Eastern Roman Empire. And almost at the very time Constantinople fell in the mid-15th century, people in the West in earnest began to improve navigation, seamanship. Instead of galleys, started to create galleons, ships that had 3 masts, 3 sails, 6 sails, 8 sails, and were able to navigate in rough seas and at great distances. And once they began to do that, they quickly discovered not only could they go along the coast of Africa, they could go around it, they could go to India, they could go to China without having to deal with either land-based transport, very expensive, 10 times more expensive than seafaring in the ancient world, or dealing with Islam. And as an accident of that effort, we know of the discovery in 1492 of Latin America, and within 100 years, most of what is today Canada, United States, and Latin America was well known to Western Portuguese, French, Spanish, but especially the English. And that pretty much sealed the fate of a Venice that had a fleet at one time of 3,000 galleys rowing all over the Mediterranean, engaging commerce from Cyprus to the coast of Crete, all the way to Malta and back into Venice and Italy and Greece and Western Europe and on the Mediterranean. All of that was obsolete. It was anachronistic. You could go cheaper on the Atlantic and bring in far more wealth than you could ever do in the Mediterranean. And sea powers like the Papal States or Venice, they were completely ill-equipped to develop ex nihilo ocean-going navigation and shipbuilding. And so by 1700, the great wealth of Latin America was pouring into Western Spain. Spain as a Mediterranean power was starting to eclipse, and it was starting to becoming a transatlantic power. But more importantly, for those countries that not only had seaports that faced the Atlantic, but were also had large Protestant populations and a Protestant ethic, so to speak, and they were starting to create sovereign states that combine resources under a single government. they started to forge ahead. And of course, they were immune from the pressures of Islam, which did not really cease and desist to about 1700. Now, what does all that mean today? It means that when we study Western civilization, most of the great work up until about 1600, 1500 perhaps, there are exceptions, of course, Shakespeare being the most notable, but most of the great works of art and architecture, a Pantheon, a Santa Sophia, a Parthenon, Sophocles, Euripides, Dante, Petrarch. Whether we go from 500 BC or we go to 1400 BC, we're essentially talking about a creation of Mediterranean culture. However, if we start to talk about literature, culture, architecture, whether it's the Gothic cathedral at Cologne, or whether it's at Strasbourg, or whether we talk about theater and comedy in England, or whether we talk about the great palaces of the monarchs in England and France or Versailles, that shift in focus has gone far to the north. And so now we are left with this paradox in Western civilization that as I speak, a Spain, an Italy, a Greece is going hat in hand to Germany, to the Netherlands, somewhat to England as well, Britain, and asking for capital or insured loans from countries that were basically full of savages when they were in their epoch. And the key thing to remember about this is it tells us something about why some societies decline and some societies prosper. They can prosper or decline because of natural catastrophe, rare, because of a defeat in war, a little bit rarer. But most often the changes are insidious, changes in trade patterns, changes in transportation, changes in religion, and changes especially in stimuli, the ability to react to stimuli. There was something about the heritage of the classical world and the heritage of its religion and the heritage of the Mediterranean that made it less able to react to the changing conditions of trade and navigation than there was in the frontier to the north. And it shouldn't have happened in some sense, because if you're going to be a farmer in England or you're going to be a farmer in northern Germany, you have a lot of disadvantage that someone in the Peloponnese does not have. If you want to just leave your coast and get in a galley and go across to France, you can't do it very easily in a way that you can go from Sicily across the Adriatic pretty easily, or you can go from the Peloponnese to Athens pretty easily. So all of those disadvantages turned out to be advantages in the long run for Northern Europe. Now, we're left with a final question. Is history static? Is it finite? Is there going to be a difference in this focus point? Will there be some kind of change that would shift the focus of power elsewhere in Europe? Northern Europe always had one problem. It was called the German problem, and that is, how does an industrial, numerous, populous, even aggressive people deal with its neighbors? And the Romans didn't quite know how to deal with Germany, so they decided arbitrarily to shut Roman civilization off at the Rhine and the Danube and leave Germany outside that orb, if you will. But after 1867-68, Germany became united, and the result was almost immediately a war, and then another war, and another war. Now we live in a period where it's no longer divided, there's no longer a Cold War, NATO is in retreat, and it has become not the military power of Europe, but it's become the financial center of Europe. And the classical countries, as I said earlier, are begging Germany for economic assistance. And the reason that they're doing that is because Germany, it turns out, as well as the Netherlands and other Northern European countries, have a far different heritage, religious, political, economic, and social than do the southern Mediterranean countries. A far different heritage that it turns out, since about 1500, is far more apt and suitable for the modern world than is Southern Europe. Will this situation change? I don't know, but if Germany is integrated within Europe, then you'll have a continual osmosis. If it's not, then the divide will grow even sharper.